The PSS dive tables are simplified calculations based on the US Navy tables. Therefore, it is very easy to use them. The maximum depth reached, at intervals of 3 meters, 10 feet, is shown on the top. The grey line below shows, in minutes, the maximum time allowed for that depth. All the values should be approximated to the next greatest whole number. In other words, if you cannot find the exact maximum depth, you must refer to the next greatest number. Let's look at a practical example. You want to make a dive from the beach to 8 meters, 26 feet. There is no column showing this depth on the table, therefore you have to refer to the next greatest number, which in this case is 9, 30 feet. The table tells you that the maximum time you can stay on this dive is 120 minutes. If, however, we decide to make a dive from a boat to a maximum depth of 16 meters, 52 feet, the maximum time for the dive is reduced to just 40 minutes. Remember, when you refer to depth, you must consider the maximum depth of the dive. Even if you go to 18 meters, 60 feet, for just a few minutes, and then spend the rest of the dive at 9 meters, 30 feet, you must consider that the entire dive is carried out at the maximum depth of 18 meters, 60 feet. This is why it is important that our depth gauges also indicate the maximum depth as well as the actual depth. The tables are designed for square profile dives, meaning that the entire dive is spent at one constant depth, and, contrary to a computer, tables cannot be used to calculate what is known as a multi-level dive, when different periods of time are spent at various depths. When you make a multi-level dive, you should always reach the deepest part of the dive first, and then dive progressively shallower. You must avoid what is known as sawtooth or yo-yo profiles, where you constantly change from deeper to shallower depths and vice versa. It is extremely important to respect the rates of ascent and descent indicated on the tables. When using the PSS dive tables, the rate of descent is 20 meters per minute, 65 feet per minute, and the rate of ascent is 10 meters per minute, 33 feet per minute. The maximum dive time given on the PSS tables includes the time it takes to descend and the ascent up to a depth of 5 meters, 15 feet. The tables do not take into account dives where you have to fin hard against a current, get very cold, or maybe don't feel very well. As a precautionary measure, in cases of cold or fatigue, you should refer to the column 3 meters, 10 feet greater than your actual maximum depth. When we surface after a dive, we need time to eliminate the excess inert gases still dissolved in our bodies. According to the PSS tables, this requires 12 hours. If we want to dive again before 12 hours has passed since our last dive, we make what is referred to as a repetitive dive. As we already have a level of excess inert gas in our body, the maximum time for the repetitive dive is reduced, depending on how long we spend out of the water, a period of time known as the surface interval. If you stay on the surface for less than 10 minutes between the first and second dive, you can consider it as one single dive. If the surface interval is more than 10 minutes, you must use the table that refers to repetitive dives. Under the maximum dive times for the first dive, there are horizontal white and grey bands showing the surface interval times. The maximum dive time given for each depth is reduced to take into account the quantity of excess inert gases still dissolved in our body tissues. As you will notice, the minimum interval between a first and a repetitive dive is 41 minutes. Therefore, you must spend at least 41 minutes on the surface before you can make a second dive. Another important rule regarding repetitive dives is that the second dive should be made at least 6 meters, 20 feet, shallower than the previous one. If, for example, you made a dive to 18 meters, 60 feet, the repetitive dive should not be deeper than 12 meters, 40 feet. The maximum dive time for a repetitive dive depends on the length of the surface interval. If 2 hours and a half have passed since you surfaced from the last dive, the maximum time you can stay at 12 meters, 40 feet, is 33 minutes. If you want to dive longer, you must increase the surface interval time. If, for example, you want to dive to 11 meters, 36 feet, for 40 minutes, you must refer to the 12 meter, 40 feet column, the next greatest depth, until you find a time greater than 40 minutes. In our example, you can see that 45 minutes corresponds to a minimum surface interval of 2 hours and 59 minutes. If the surface interval is greater than 12 hours, you may consider any dive that you want to make as a first dive.